Hello, everybody. My name is Matt Hardy. I'm the Program Director for Planning and Performance Management here at AASHTO. And to everybody on the line today, welcome to our 58th webinar in our FHWA AASHTO Transportation Asset Management webinar series. Today, as states are completing their federally required 2022 TAMPs, we're taking a look at the new resiliency-related requirements for those asset management plans introduced in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act title. This is a timely topic, and we wanted to sort of bring together 3 states to share their approaches and to discuss successful practices and some common challenges among them. We are returning today to topics that we've touched on in some of our past webinars. For example, in our February TAM webinar, we had a great dialogue on the overall 2022 TAM development process. And back in December of 2021, we had a special webinar on transportation performance management and the BIL. So if you missed either of those webinars, I encourage you to look them up on the AASHTO TAM portal. You can visit that at tam-portal.com. And the portal has all the information on this webinar series, past, present, and future. Again, tam-portal.com. Click on the events in the main menu. There you can register for upcoming webinars as they are announced, and you'll also find, again, archives to all the previous webinars and lots of other great information about asset management in general. And you can visit there are other portals, including performance management and then risk management as well, by going to the TAM portal. Links to the video, the recording, and slides from today's webinar will be posted to that site. That's a common question that we do get. So we make all this information available to you. And as usual, if you have any suggestions on future webinar topics, you can submit those to us at the TAM portal or using the Zoom chat feature, and we can capture that information. At the end of today's session, we do plan on having a question and answer session and a dialogue. So please, again, use that Zoom chat functionality to ask your questions, and we will get to them. We'll try to answer as many as we can once we get to that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my good friend Tashia Clemons from FHWA for a welcome on behalf of our very important co-sponsor, the Federal Highway Administration. Tashia, all yours.
Thank you, Matt. Hello, everyone. It's really great to see everyone is back and being part of these webinar series. This is so exciting. Federal Highways, in cooperation with AASHTO, is very pleased to sponsor this Transportation Asset Management webinar series. Today, we're taking a look at states' 2022 TAMPs and the BIL, specifically the new resiliency-related requirements. As you know, BIL introduced additional resiliency-related requirements to the 2022 TAMPs. States were offered by Federal Highways the opportunity to extend the due date of their TAMP to December 2022 in order to provide time to address the new requirements. These are new processes and requirements for all of us, and we are all learning a lot together. So we're particularly happy to see so many of you joining us for this webinar today. I'm certainly looking forward to hearing from today's speakers, and I hope you've brought your questions and comments for our panelists. While we at Federal Highways must speak with care on these topics, I will be happy to answer as many questions as I can. I think you will enjoy today's presentations and discussions, and I hope we'll all learn a lot this afternoon. And I'm also looking forward to seeing all of you on many more webinars to come. And so with that, I want to go ahead and turn this over to Hyana Park of Spy Partners to share our agenda and objectives for today's webinar. Hyana.
Thanks, Tasha. All right, I'll cover our objectives and agenda for today and get us right into our presentations. The purpose of this special webinar and dialogue is three-part. First off, it's to raise awareness of the BIL's implications and impacts on TAMP development, focusing on the new resiliency-related requirements. Secondly, it's to understand some of the approaches agencies are taking to plan and prepare their BIL compliant 2022 TAMPs. And finally, it's to hear from you. We're looking forward to some great questions and a good dialogue today. For the agenda today, we'll start with our state DOT presentations. We're lucky to have a great lineup for you today. Joining us, we have William Johnson of the Colorado DOT, Todd Lamphere and Jonathan Falk of the Washington State DOT, and Mike Johnson of Caltrans. They'll all bring various different approaches to how they've approached their BIL compliant TAMPs. Following the presentations, we'll have a quick poll and a quick Q&A, and then a discussion with questions from you, our audience. Please submit your comments or questions using the webinar chat feature. You can do that anytime during today's presentation. And when we get to the Q&A part, we'll go through the questions you've raised, but you can also unmute yourself and have a dialogue by voice as well. So now let's get started with our panelist presentations. First up, we'll hear from William Johnson of the Colorado DOT. William is the Performance and Asset Management Branch Manager at CDOT, responsible for CDOT's performance measures and asset management programs. William recently hit the 20-year mark with CDOT. Previously, he served as GIS Data Management Section Manager and Mobility Planner within the department. Now I'll turn it over to William.
Hey, Anna, thank you. Can you give me a thumbs up if you're able to see my screen okay? I'll take that as a confirmation.
I said yes, and I thought it was my camera that was on, not my microphone.
I think you're on mute. Yeah, I'm just going to give you a quick call out of perspective. I wanted to also recognizing that one of the questions asked due to sort of the timing on when the TAMPs are due, some states chose to put their new targets for asset management in, others chose not to. Colorado chose to include them. We went through and we developed targets for pavement and bridge, just giving you a quick peek on what they are. Of notable things on here is that we're at 3.9% poor on interstate NHS. And if you recall, once you hit that 5% poor, that's where you start to get into that federal penalty, or we really call it a federal restriction on funds for NHPP. I think that ours runs to the tune of about $100 to $150 million annually. So that's one of the things we monitor closely, but it is very much related towards bill requirements, especially when we consider risk and resilience. Now, recognizing that not everybody on this webinar has had an opportunity to look at or participate in previous discussions on what requirements are, I just include a little bit of information on what are those bill requirements, what's the relevant. And here you could see just in the bolded area requires that states take into consideration extreme weather and resilience within their life cycle costs and risk management analysis. I've also included a handy link there. Oops. The other thing is that requirement came out with a memorandum from FHWA. So in addition to those considerations for extreme weather events in your life cycle planning processes and risk management analysis, DOT still had to turn in their TAMPs on time, but there was an extension for flexibility, and that extension was really extended to DOTs so that they have time to be in requirement with that change from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And states had to request that extension within their consistency determination for the TAMP. And I will say that Colorado did actually request that extension. And I'll get into it shortly onto why. Now, just sort of laying out the land for CDOT, we have 12 asset classes. And for the most part, in our what I'll call our normal budget, it comprises the largest component of it, roughly $760 to $800 million annually. And in this graph, you could actually see what our 12 asset classes are. Of course, we have pavement and bridge, but we also have some things that, you know, other DOTs may or may not be managing, like their fleet, and rest areas are also included. One thing that I find unique about Colorado is we do formally manage our geohazards, which are things like, you know, rock slides, mudslides, debris flow, under our asset management program, in such that we manage the hazard, not necessarily geohazards as an asset. We have a multi-asset management system where out of the 12 asset classes that we're managing, 11 of them are within our multi-asset management system. The one outside of that is naturally maintenance levels of service that is operated off of a performance-based system. Now, even before the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, resilience and considering resilience, especially within asset management, has been an important part of the things that we do. I just have a couple snippets here demonstrating the importance. One of which is looking at a recent study by FilterBuy. No idea what FilterBuy does, but I want to give them credit. The link is below. They're using information from the National Centers on Environmental Information State Climate Extreme Committee's records. So it is an authoritative data source. They went through, and, you know, through that link, you'll be able to see the methodology. Colorado is one of the states with the most extreme weather being, you know, it can sway one way or another, from being very hot to very cold to being normal type of weather versus, you know, extreme weather events. We're number 4. If anybody's curious, California is number 1. I will attribute that to, it's a very large state in terms of geography. The other thing, and this is information from NOAA, is in 2021, out of the $20 billion disasters, Colorado was affected by 5 of them. So, you know, I always joke when I talk about resilience in Colorado that it seems like from one year to the next, it feels like half the state is on fire. But understanding that, yes, we have a lot of fires, but it's the flooding and the debris flows that really cause the expensive events that Colorado has. And, you know, when we're talking about the flooding and debris flows, that's really where we get into the role of asset management in terms of being proactive, being very thoughtful, and really considering risk and resilience and extreme weather events in the things that we do. Now, I've labeled these as sort of steps. I have a 9-step program for, you know, how we approach this within our asset management plan. Our number 1 is, well, we have an existing resilience program. I wouldn't confuse this as Colorado doing formal enterprise risk management. Our risk and resilience program is really heavily geared towards infrastructure. It is within my group, the Performance and Asset Management branch, and that allows us to be closely aligned with performance and asset management, as well as economic analysis. We are also one of the DOTs that has a formal policy on resilience. So this policy, it's signed by our Transportation Commission, really calls for us to consider resilience whenever we get into infrastructure investment decision making. The other thing that the Risk and Resilience Program does is, you'll see below, we have a number of tools that have already been developed. In those tools, and for many of them, we have YouTube tutorials. So shameless plug here, the link is below. You have access to all those tools as well as the YouTube tutorials, but that really gives us a head start in that analysis piece that Bill is calling for. So with this, in terms of leveraging, it's really, how do we incorporate the resilience program into our asset management plan and processes? The other thing that we look to is, hey, there's a lot of research. There's a lot of work that has been done on, you know, risk and resilience. And, you know, I'll point to, and this is a not so shameless plug for AASHTO, you go to the AASHTO Transportation Management Hub, there's a lot of resources that you're going to find there, easily searchable tools. That's it sort of on the bottom left-hand side. You have stuff dealing with asset management. You have the enterprise risk management portal in there as well. You have the performance management portal. All resources that, it's sort of the nexus between risk and resilience as you're talking about performance-based management there. The other thing is AASHTO's ERM guide, a plug for the new implementation guide for that AASHTO ERM guide. It was just published. I want to say that I actually finally got the copy today. So that's there. Then the TAM guide. The TAM guide is a web-based resource. And then, of course, the ISO 31000 series. That's the risk management series. If anything, the ISO guide is good for understanding terms and definitions, as well as process steps for doing just risk management that absolutely applies towards asset management. The next thing is, now that we understand what we're doing, we have the tools to do it, we understand how to talk about it, is within our asset management plan, we more or less codified what our informal organization structure is. And you'll see things there such as, our coordination with external entities. CTSSR is the Committee on Transportation System Security and Resilience. That conference is happening in Hawaii next week. So sad I won't be able to join those who are going to Hawaii to participate in that. But then there's also in Colorado a very strong core group of people focused on resilience. We had a big flood in 2013, very expensive event. And that was sort of a catalyst for us galvanizing different groups, different agencies that had resilience focused. And with that, we've learned from things. And if not just communicate, we've learned those lines of communication and who to talk to. And I think really, that sort of serves as exemplary of what that informal organization does, is it articulates who we talk to and for what purpose. The fourth one is refine risk assessment processes. So the TAMP is supposed to serve two purposes, one of which is the actual plan in of itself. The other one is it's a documentation of the processes used to develop that plan. So in this, we do very carefully articulate what our processes are in relationship to the things that we'll be implementing within the plan. You'll see a lot of common things here, such as identify, analyze, evaluate, and there's some analogs to this, but then you'll see other things such as establish the context, which for us is we're beginning more and more to focus on community resilience. And that's a different context. Before we were really concerned about how do I protect this asset? And now the conversation is sort of focusing towards, well, we protect the asset for our users, and our users are the community. So establishing that context is very important. The next thing you'll see there is that manage and monitor. Part 6.7, if you're disfamiliar with that, that's a requirement for us to understand the assets that have been damaged more than once as a result of an emergency event declared by the president or your governor, and look at, if you've had one of those damaged assets, are there reasonable alternative strategies to develop there? And we very closely monitor those and look at it. In case anybody's wondering, we did find one asset as a result of a geohazard event on I-70 in Glenwood Canyon that has been damaged more than once. And it's something that we're going through the process right now. It wasn't done in time to get our TAMP done in time of the deadline, where we're assessing what does that mean in terms of reasonable alternative strategies. Again, another reason why we did request an extension in submitting that final version of our TAMP. The other thing, so we're getting into that, what are the bill requirements, considerations, and life cycle plannings in our TAMP? These are snapshots that you have here. So we clearly state what our life cycle planning initiatives are. Now, when you look at these levels, enterprise, program, project, activity, these are adopted from the AASHTO ERM guide in terms of categorizations of threats. We look at things based on these categories, and we did that partly because we didn't want to remake the wheel here, but also because it helps us communicate this and keeps referential integrity. So when we talk about enterprise, if we're talking about enterprise when it comes to life cycle planning, we're also talking about enterprise when we're discussing our risk register. So these things sort of translate. Talking about risk register, here's a rough snapshot of our high level risk management analysis. Now, extreme weather events and consideration of extreme weather events in risk management analysis. You will see here that some of our top threats are extreme weather events. Again, I mentioned, there's a lot of fire in Colorado. Fire's on there, but what we really feel the effects from on our transportation system is post-fire debris flow and flood. Those are some of our top risk in here. So we absolutely do include those extreme weather events within our risk management analysis. Again, snapshots that are within our TAM. I mentioned part 667. Now, what the important thing here is, hey, not that CDOT has one event that they've captured, not that we go through the process of analyzing the public roads and determining what has been damaged more than once as a result of an ER event, but more so that we've developed a process that is incorporated in our TAMP. By incorporation means we have to implement it for how we consider those twice damaged assets in investment decision making. And you'll see what the start is hey, something was damaged. The end is include in STIP. And statewide transportation improvement program, what that means is sort of by proxy is you include it in your STIP. You're making a commitment towards investment decision making. So when we sort of go through this bobsled run of our process, knowing that we're going to have to make a decision of whether or not we're going to fund some resiliency, and this can either be as a result of it's come up due on our database as being low condition. We're going to take care of this now. To we have an opportunity here as part of life cycle planning to address something before it truly becomes a problem. It ends up with that investment decision. Number 8 is just a recognition that more work needs to be done. I sort of said, we've got these robust processes in terms of incorporating our resilience program and incorporating the existing body of knowledge, working on processes. Well, still more work to be done. And, here I want to recognize LCP, life cycle planning. I've been one of the people that reviewed every single TAMP from the first generation of federally required TAMPs. And I would argue that every DOT can improve on life cycle planning. We recognize that that's a challenge at CDOT. I want to point here is AIMS is our asset investment management system. One of the challenges that we're trying to address quickly for our actual certifiable TAMP is there a way for us to incorporate all the analysis that we're doing on threats and put it into our modeling so that we can get improved model recommendations, those treatments that we'll be funding. The other thing is extreme weather and resilience. We understand that, we've got robust tools. We can always make improvements. One of the improvements that we're trying to do right now is you'll see a lot of Excel-based tools. If you go to that website I mentioned earlier, CDOT Resilience, and with those Excel-based tools, nobody really likes to work with Excel. How do we make those tools easier to work with? And then I will end with, we request an extension. Why? Well, it's because we have 12 assets within our asset management plan. We've spent a lot of time focusing on, our bread and butter, pavement and bridge, especially on the interstate and NHS. But we really want to have a couple months to refine the things that we're doing for the other assets. While it's not necessarily, letter of the law that we have to do this for all 12 of our assets outside of pavement and bridge, it's definitely within the spirit and intent of what the requirements are, but more so is because our asset management plan is first and foremost our asset management plan. It's the CDOT asset management plan. So we're trying to get this information in there so that we could use it truly as a CDOT resource, not just in terms of achieving FHWA compliance. That's the end of my presentation. I know I flew through a lot of concepts quickly. I'm going to pass it back to Hiana.
All right. Thank you, William. Now we'll hear from Todd Lamphere and John Falk of the Washington State DOT. Todd serves as the statewide transportation asset manager responsible for leading Washington State DOT's asset management program. This program has 4 major asset categories that include ferries, highways, intra-agency, which includes facilities, information technology, real estate services, and the Transportation Equipment Fund, and multimodal, which includes aviation, public transportation, and rail. These categories encompass 21 asset classes that make up Washington State DOT's multimodal transportation system, valued at nearly $200 billion. Todd serves as a member of the AASHTO Subcommittee on Asset Management and a friend of the TRB Asset Management Committee. He's also a member of the FHWA TAM Expert Task Group. Todd will be joined in his presentation today by Jonathan Falk. Jonathan is a transportation asset management specialist. He was one of the leads in updating the 2022 FHWA Pavement and Bridge TAMP and is currently leading the asset management efforts in the highways major asset category. He has also worked on the development and update of Washington State's statewide transportation asset management plan, or STAMP as they call it. He has been with Washington State DOT for almost 5 years in positions that are responsible for transportation asset management and transportation policy. Prior to Washington State DOT, he served as a graduate student research assistant at the University of Wisconsin for the National Center for Freight Infrastructure Research and Education, where he was responsible for conducting research on performance management in transportation sustainability. Okay, take it away, Todd and Jonathan.
Thank you, Yana. Just want to spend a few minutes talking to you about kind of Washington State's journey in getting to a BIL compliant TAMP. Like Yana said, I'm joined today by John. I'm going to cover the high level stuff and things, how it affected the agency, some of the steps we had to take that we either didn't plan to take organizationally, and trying to navigate BIL compliance. John's going to talk specifically to some of the updates we made within the TAMP. And I'll close a little bit on how we're structuring resiliency in the department. So next slide, John. Our roadmap for BIL compliance is the October-November timeframe. The IIJA bill added the requirement for states to include extreme weather and resilience in their life cycle costs and risk analyses portions of their TAMP. We saw that, read that, and we interpreted that. Luckily, at the same time that this requirement came out, we were right in the middle of our risk workshops for bridge and pavement. I should mention our TAMP only includes bridge and pavement assets. We do have asset management plans for the rest that Yana mentioned, but the ones we submit to FHWA are limited to bridge and pavement. So this requirement came out at a really good time where we for sure could have this included into our risk analyses, our risk workshop. So we kind of huddled at the time and said, how do we bring this in to the workshop right now? And on the fly made some changes to our process in the risk workshop to incorporate that. We did, as we worked through the TAMP, and John will go through some of the specific elements in the TAMP, we did create alignment through the life cycle cost analysis and the risk analysis with this particular new requirement, considering extreme weather and resilience. Our TAMP was due in May 18th as the exact date. It was literally on the secretary's desk waiting for signature as the Federal Highway Administration issued the memo that William referenced before, the clarification memo. So that added a little bit of questions, if you will. We've got a great relationship with our division office. So we called him, had kind of a huddle as we did many times throughout this process, and were able to get what he was comfortable with. As our secretary signed the TAMP, it was then recertified early June to be BIL compliant. With the submission to FHWA, I think it was Matt Hardy that mentioned the TAM portal. There's a lot of resources on there. One of the resources is from Washington State. It's our transmittal letter to the division office, where we put in there that we believe our TAMP was BIL compliant. That's not the only place that we had that written. We worked with our division office every other week. We met with him and to become BIL compliant, to work through different things. We sent the division office chapters as they became developed, and he circulated those for broader comment. So when our division office received the TAMP, it wasn't the first time they saw it. They had an opportunity to comment all throughout the development. So it wasn't a surprise to them to get it. And I think that made our journey to becoming BIL compliant a little bit easier. Didn't remove all the hurdles, but it made it a little bit easier. And secondly, and certainly not least, we did submit our annual consistency determination along with the other state DOTs, and we were approved with that particular area. So the next, John's going to talk to you a little bit about risk and life cycle planning and kind of some of the elements that the detail that WashDOT had to work through within those particular areas. And then I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about our efforts in resiliency in the agency. Go ahead, John.
Thanks, Todd. So good afternoon, good morning, or afternoon, wherever you are. So just going a little bit, as Todd mentioned, talking a little bit about what we did at Washington State in terms of looking at IIJA for our plans. So we're talking about a little bit life cycle planning. So we do include some instances where we do consider extreme weather and resiliency. The one thing we do want to point out, we wanted to highlight the fact that these are existing practices. These are not new practices that are in there because of IIJA bill. So we just wanted to emphasize that we looked at a lot of what we were doing currently and the process that we had in terms of being able to look at resiliency in extreme weather. So up here, we have a couple examples. So we do look at from our pavement side. So with our life cycle cost analysis, when it comes to site-specific assumptions, that also helped us in terms of being able to determine costs in terms of the construction and the preservation of the asset over its life cycle. And then we also do look at, for the bridge side, we do look at extreme weather and resilience in terms of our scour mitigation and seismic retrofit for planning strategies for bridge. In addition to, as we said, we're talking about both life cycle and risk. So one of the areas that we talked with in regards to the risk was looking at our workshops. So what we did at Washington State was being able to update who was a part of the scoring efforts. So in addition to our asset stewards for bridge and pavement, and we also included our maintenance office folks, as well as members from the Resiliency Work Group Steering Committee. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in detail. But the idea was trying to bring more awareness with resiliency and extreme weather when it came to updating our risk register. So with that, we were able to include some additional statements that encompass that, the resiliency and extreme weather aspects of in our TAM. So we do provide some examples for both pavement and bridge in there. I'm not going to go into specific details, but these are just some examples of what we looked at and what was a part of the results for the risk register, and also looking at risk treatment planning strategies as well. So in addition to looking at our register, so as was mentioned previously by William, there's also the Part 667 requirement that state DOTs have to take in consideration. So with that, we also included language in there in our analysis when it came to looking at resiliency in extreme weather. This was a lot of work with our planning office internally at WashDOT, but also working with the FHWA planning side, the state office as well. So fortunately, with that effort, we were able to do the analysis, but it goes to show in terms of the work that we do internally with WashDOT, how much emphasis and importance resiliency in extreme weather is, because it does apply to other areas of the agency, and it also applies externally with our partners as well. So with that, speaking about partners, I'll turn it back over to Todd to talk a little more about that.
Thanks a bunch, John. Next slide. Oh, we're on the next slide. Resiliency work group. So Washington State DOT has had for about 5 or 6 years what's called a resiliency work group. It started out as a seismic work group. And as we quickly realized, these activities are broader than seismic. So we started, like most other state DOTs on the West, saw wildfires, floods, and other things that came up that we needed to address in this particular work group. And the purpose was really to coordinate across different programs, because a wildfire doesn't just affect one mode or program. The wildfire or flood could affect the highway program, but it could also affect our rail division, could affect our aviation division as they're trying to coordinate from some of the state-owned airports. So we found that a lot of coordination was needed, as well as sharing information. What are you doing in these situations? What did you learn? What would you do differently? So that helped. The committee is also comprised of various members throughout the division, from the funding arm of the organization to the planning arm of the organization, obviously programs and modes, from the ferry system to aviation. All the regions, our 6 different DOT regions are represented there. It is heavily participated in by maintenance throughout the area, throughout the agency. However, others are attending as well. Roughly 3 years ago, we made a change that this committee reported to the Asset Management Executive Steering Committee, and using that structure as the decision-making body for that particular area. John, next slide. This is kind of a look at currently what we have. Probably the newest area that we've added here is that human resources element. Quickly through the pandemic, realized that we needed to have our people there in that particular area. So that was one of the big changes and the expense from the resiliency committee. The next slide, it kind of jumps right into the topic I want to take us to. So for years, we've had a goal. You'll go to the next slide, John. A goal of practical solutions, which is being practical about your choices and what you do the right choice at the right time, type thing. And we're replacing that with resilience and using that resilient structure. So we in WashDOT are adding resilience as a strategic plan goal. It's one of 3, and we're building that out. Asset management is now part of the resilience strategic plan goal, where resilience was part of asset management. It's becoming part of the resilience, which is the strategic plan goal. So we're building that out. We're working with our partners. It's expanding as we speak. We're actually in kind of the process of controlling the expansiveness, so it doesn't get so big that we're unable to do things or to navigate that in that area. So this is going to become really important as we move into improving the next TAMP with resilience and extreme weather. As you heard from John and my earlier comments, we didn't have time to do anything really new in the area. We had time to inventory what we were already doing and write things that we could take credit for within our TAMP. Moving forward with resilience being a strategic plan goal, we're able to start to have a forum where we can brainstorm what one person's doing in one program, add it to another program, and really start to catalog that information for the next TAMP to improve resilience in extreme weather, improve the process for how we're going to evaluate that in the TAMP, and ultimately look at how we're going to have all of this impact or affect our investment decisions and how we're going to make choices differently because of this information. That's really our approach, probably in a nutshell. And I don't have this on a slide anywhere. The key points to us, I would say, becoming BIL compliant was being flexible and being nimble as requirements were being understood coming out throughout the process. You've heard me say this multiple times before, having that good relationship with your division office is paramount for this and anything, to be able to work with, keeping them in the loop and in the know. We involve our division office from the asset management perspective in all of the asset management discussions, not just required for FHWA. So they participate in all of our committee meetings. And they're really the 2 points that I think I would take away here. And also there's a community. We've got a community, putting a plug for the TRB and AASHTO community to ask questions of the group. There's a lot of folks that are willing to help you meet the requirement. With that, I think that John and I will take any questions. There are 2 slides in what we call the appendix. If you're interested to look at more information about what we put in our risk chapter, you can look there. And a link to our TAMP is there. It's now on our website. Yana, I think it's back to you.
All right. Thank you, both Todd and Jonathan. All right. Joining us next is Mike Johnson of Caltrans. Mike is the Caltrans State Asset Management Engineer. He's been with Caltrans for over 30 years. And in his current capacity, he's responsible for leading the implementation of asset management and the development of the State Highway Operation and Protection Program, better known as SHOP. The SHOP is a $4.5 billion annual program of projects that address rehabilitation and operation needs for the state-owned transportation system. In addition, Mike has held numerous national positions with TRB, AASHTO, and FHWA's expert task groups. Over to you now, Mike.
Thank you, Yana. Thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit about what we did in California with respect to incorporating resiliency into our TAMP. And I think much like you heard from Washington, California didn't just scramble when BIL passed. We had been doing work in the climate arena for years prior to BIL passage. I'm sure many of you are aware that California has a long history with our governors of setting extremely aggressive emissions standards, and there's been corollary work maybe that's less visible outside of California in a lot of climate resiliency areas. So, when BIL passed for us, it was really already being reflected in our TAMP, because our TAMP is also required to be approved by our California Transportation Commission, and their expectation is in alignment with the administration and that of Caltrans that that climate stressors, climate resiliency are a significant threat to the transportation system, and we need to start, working on them. So our work, started years ago, and our TAMP just really reflects what we've been doing. So I put this quote in. I kind of like this. When it comes to risk, resiliency certainly fits in that risk arena, and it has to be balanced across your TAMP and across your investment decision-making with your available budget and what you need to do in other areas. So Hyana mentioned the program that I coordinate for Caltrans, which is now with IIJA about a $5 billion annual program of projects, and it includes climate resiliency as well as fixing pavements and bridges and many buildings. In fact, California and Washington approach to asset management is very similar. It's significantly broader than what's required in an asset management plan. So I would say, looking at this presentation, well, where do you start? And everything starts with assessment of the risks. So where are your risks? What are your risks? In California, we look at, historically, we've looked and invested heavily in seismic risks and in bridge scour risks and in geotechnical risks. And now, more recently, a lot of the climate stressors. And for us, the climate stressors are heat, drought, and fire, and they're all somewhat related. Sea level rise and extreme rainfall are also things that our plans consider. So a number of years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, our planning department within Caltrans initiated vulnerability assessments for all of our regions in California. So the state, it's a big state. It's quite diverse. So in certain parts of the state, we have heavily forested areas that have high fire risk. We have coastal areas that are subject to coastal climate impacts. And then we even have tidally influenced river areas that are more internal. And then extreme rainfall and heat are in various parts of California. So we really did 12 individual vulnerability assessments based on the 12 districts that our state is broken into. And each one is very tailored to that particular region of California. So for example, here's just one graphic from a Southern California area. This is in our Newport Beach area. And this is showing sea level rise inundation expectations by time. And so we understand that there will be transportation assets. In this case, showing Highway 1 or the Pacific Coast Highway. Many of you that have been to California may have been on this. It's a very popular highway, but it's also a very low-lying coastal highway that is quite vulnerable in certain parts of the state to sea level rise. So we need to understand, where it's vulnerable, because it's not vulnerable on its entire length. Some parts of the Pacific Coast Highway are quite elevated and others are really, really low. And so understanding where you're going to experience your climate stressors first helps you to prioritize where you might want to work early versus late. This is a graph we put together back in 2021. We started really in 2020, and this builds on our vulnerability assessments, which is really a GIS type of exercise, because over time the sea level rise grow, inundation and storm surge begin to impact more and more of your system. And we in asset management endeavored to put a price tag on this. And there's a lot of different assumptions that can be made with respect to sea level rise. One of which is, what are the emission levels going to be going forward? And then what is our risk tolerance? And depending on those different things, you get different answers, and you can kind of see that splayed out here. By California policy, governmental policy, we are required to use that red line, which is really kind of the worst case scenario: high emissions, very low risk tolerance for any inundation or storm surge. And you could see, based on our next 10 years, we were anticipating about $11.1 billion worth of needs. And as you go through time, the needs grow because the sea level rise keeps getting higher and the limits of the system expand. The reason I'm kind of dwelling on this is that this is one of the few things within the asset management plan that is really time dependent. You could argue deterioration is time dependent, and that's true. But here the need grows, and it grows, you can see, quite rapidly over time. So this is something that we want to weave into our life cycle plans. And I'll talk a little bit about how we do that. More from our vulnerability assessments is looking at wildfire and areas where we'd have wildfire concern, much like William talked about in Colorado and Todd talked about in Washington. California has some severe wildfires historically, and in the last few years have been even more prevalent. So how are these risks incorporated into our TAMP? You heard William talked about the 667 requirements, looking at repeatedly damaged infrastructure. Caltrans has tracked where we do emergency work for decades. And so when the 667 requirements came out, we already had a multiple year database of where we've done work, whether it's declared emergency or just a declared emergency by our department. We have that information in a tracking system. We did make some changes to it to acknowledge what was NHS and what wasn't NHS, and a few other changes with the 667 requirement changes. But again, this was one of those things that we had long-standing practices in place that we leveraged for the purposes of the TAMP. But ultimately, risks, if you're going to mitigate risk, and I would argue if you're going to assess where they are, the intent is to try to mitigate them to some degree. And if you're going to mitigate them, it will have an impact on your finances because you're going to spend money to mitigate, and that means there's money you don't have available for other things. One of the challenge areas that we have in California is we have 650 different cities and counties in California, and almost every one of them can have a different approach to risk management. And so, one of the questions we ask a lot is whose risk management plan goes into our asset management plan? It can't just be Caltrans, because we account for about 65% of the pavement on the NHS. Locals account for the other 35%. We account for a little over 90% of the bridge area. The locals account for the balance. And so we had to understand, well, what is it that all of our partner agencies are doing? And there's a lot, and their strategies are, cover a spectrum of different things. So that was a little bit of a challenge to try to encompass all of that within the California TAMP covering the national highway system. And then, I talked a little bit about allocation of funds, and I'll show you how we do that in California. But, this is really the way that we see it. And when it comes to climate resiliency specifically and the mitigation of that, we are consciously timing that with end of life work wherever possible. So if we have a pavement segment that is in really good condition, and we also have a sea level rise need, we might want to cool our jets a little bit on that, let the pavement run out its full life cycle, wait till you need to do something with the pavement, then address the elevation and the pavement at the same time. Another challenge is that these various vulnerabilities all have different assessment criteria and different schedules and scales of how they work. So for asset management, it's very challenging to try to bring all this together in a way that makes sense. And there's some ways to do that. You can use a risk-based grid like this to try to put all of your risks on a common scale, including your climate resiliency risk, to help you really understand as a state, and particularly one as diverse as California, what are our priorities for investment for mitigation? We've also done some research that SpyPond did for us that looked at how we could possibly monetize all of these risks as another way to sort of transcend the fact that they have different criteria and different measurement methodologies, but bring them all together so that you can really look at, well, what are our totality of risks and how do they stack up against each other? I think that's a really important exercise that DOTs need to do. I mentioned that we did a vulnerability assessment. Our planning division within Caltrans also did climate adaptation reports. So we did 12 vulnerability assessments, and then we did a follow-on reports, which are, how do we adapt to these vulnerabilities and what are the priorities? And those discussions were again done in regional basis for each of our 12 districts. Heavy input from the local maintenance staff, where are they having to routinely do maintenance and so forth, as well as understanding what our partners were doing in the area and where we might need to coordinate and collaborate with them. So why do we think about this or worry about this in the TAMP? And this is a pie chart that I put together that represents about $5 billion worth of work on an annual basis. And about 58% of that work is going to address the condition of physical assets. So the things that are required in a TAMP, pavement, bridges, and in California, we look at a lot of other assets, culverts, traffic management systems, overhead sign structures, lights, facilities, roadside rest, pump facilities, and more. In total, the $5 billion that we're managing is looking at 34 different objectives, as we call them, and that includes risk-based objectives like safety, seismic retrofit of bridges, scour mitigation of bridges and culverts, geotechnical instabilities, and all of the climate stressors. And then we also have this, what I call everything else, which is, emergency work, congestion, bike and peds, stormwater, environmental, and many other things. But you can see from this that risk is a pretty substantial portion of the funding that we have. And you can also see that if we were to increase our risk mitigation investment, we would have to reduce our investment in physical assets or pare back on the everything else category. So as we expand the mitigation, it may mean a compromise in the condition of our assets or some other objective that we have as a state. There's a lot going on in this slide. I'm not going to try to go through all of it, but I wanted to highlight a couple of things. One right here. This is a tool that we put together for all of our metropolitan planning organizations in California to use. And this does a very high-level analysis of available funding, condition, inventory and condition of assets, deterioration, and it does a calculation of expected outcomes. And it does this at a 10-year period, a 4-year period, and then we interpolate for a 2-year period. And this is what we use to help build the TAMP targets within California. And you'll notice here that this area that I've circled shows the 5 federal work types in terms of budget, what's available. And you can see here percent spent on risk mitigation of each of these 5 federal work types. It's 0. And if we spend nothing on risk mitigation, then we have it available largely for preservation, rehab, and reconstruction. And for this particular MPO, and this is looking just at their pavement assets, they've got about 250 lane miles of pavement that they're managing in this MPO. And with the investment levels that they have, distributed over the 5 work types that they have, we expect that their conditions would result in 9.3% of their pavement being poor at the end of 10 years. Okay, and that is different than their target. You could see their target's a little bit more aggressive than that. So this is with no risk investment. If you now put investment into risk, so let's say we took 10% of our budget in preservation and rehab and 20% of our reconstruction budget, and we spend that on risk mitigation, we will reduce the risk, but now you could see that we're getting further away. Our poor condition pavement is a little bit worse. And then down below, the gap analysis in terms of pavement lane miles and the cost to address that pavement lane miles are going up. So it's really important that, you know, within your TAMP, you understand that the more risk mitigation you want to do, generally speaking, there are going to be compromises in the condition of your assets. And that's something that this tool that we put together really was well received by a lot of our Mpos and even some of our smaller agencies that wanted to use this to expand beyond the NHS assets so that they could start to have a conversation and do some analysis about the investment levels they have relative to the expectations of condition targets that may have existed within the various agencies in California. So kind of quick overview, hit a number of different areas to just trying to put this all together and put a bow on it. This all starts with understanding what your risks are. And if you haven't, you know, done a thorough vetting of what your vulnerabilities are, I would say start there. Because without that, everything else is downstream of that. You know, the varied risk assessment methods that you may have, there are ways to put them together on a common scale. And I think I would highly recommend that because that will help inform your investment decision making, and particularly if you're going to invest in risk mitigation, what of the risks are you going to invest in? Are those climate risks, or are they other risks that you might have? And then, you know, within the TAMP, risk enters into the financial area, life cycle planning, investment strategy. You know, in all of those areas, it's sort of intertwined as much as the physical assets condition is. And then, you know, in Caltrans, you know, we are looking at the overlay of these climate risks, or all of our risks really, in conjunction with the need to do physical asset end of life work. So if we need to rehab or we need to replace, let's say a bridge, we're not gonna just do that without making sure that it's now climate resilient. And so we have design policies that require us to look out at sea level rise and things. So if we're going to replace a coastal bridge, we're generally building it back higher above the sea level than it currently is. And we're trying to time that at when the bridge life ends, so that as we're incurring those costs that we would have to do to replace, we're also addressing some of the climate resiliency needs. With that, Hyana, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, thank you, Mike. All right, that concludes our featured presentations for today. Thank you to all of our presenters for sharing their experiences and some great observations and insights. So now, before we open up the Q&A, we have a brief Mentee Poll. It's just 2 questions. So if you could go over to mentee.com and enter the code 6473-3408. You can see that on the top of your screen right now. And the poll's really for our state DOT attendees. We're asking about whether you requested the extension for your 2022 TAMP or not. And we want to understand you know, what made you choose the direction that you made, and then we'll just use that as a prompt for some of the conversations. We do have a handful of questions people have put into the chat that we'll go through in a minute, but we thought we would do the poll first and then see where we land. So if you could just go to the Mentee Poll and put your information in, and we'll just see kind of a summary of what people have chosen. So so it looks like you know, more states requested the extension, at least those who are with us here today, then like by about a factor of 2, and then some don't knows. So we'll give a few more seconds. So that's interesting. I didn't know that that would be the, I know Tashia, you know the answer, so all right. Oh, and there are more people who requested the extension. All right. Thanks, Perry. Let's see. So why or why not? Because it's an option. Our division office determined our TAMP was already BIL compliant, so that must be why they didn't, to better align target setting for the October 1 deadline. Some better sync time frame for future TAMP with TPM targets. BIL requirements are fluid, new, and we're developing their processes. We did it because we want more time to address risk and resiliency. It helps us to incorporate the new, oops, I missed that, okay. All right, well, hard to see all of it. So kind of some common themes of what that you've met it, so you didn't request it, wanting more time to address the requirements and the intent of the requirements, wanting to align with the October target setting requirements, and seem like the general answers. All right. So let's go to the questions that people have asked, and let's go through that, and then we'll open it up. So we'll go through the questions, and then we can talk about if people are surprised by the results of the Mentee Poll. All right, so there was a question that came from Michelle Mayfield. And it says, does adding additional assets to the TAMP that are not expressly required by the regulations provide the potential to get more funding for their maintenance? If yes, under what program? Who wants to respond to Michelle?
I can take a first shot at it, since I'm
Okay.
the one who showed what assets were included.
Yeah.
A large part of our asset management program is funded by federal dollars. Federal dollars aren't eligible for use on traditional maintenance programs. I'm going to sort of extend your question to mean something beyond just regular, run-of-the-mill maintenance, and think of it as preventive maintenance. The answer is what you get from the feds is what you get from the feds. But in Colorado, we chose to do it because our Transportation Commission is curious what the game plan is for assets. And our Transportation Commission is the body in Colorado that establishes the performance measures and targets for our 12 asset classes. And that does serve as more or less the investment strategy for Colorado. So by incorporating that within, again, it's CDOT TAMP first. Within the game plan, we can clearly articulate, here's what the asset classes are, here's what the need is, need in terms of dollars, and here's where we're tracking on achieving the performance target that you, the commission, have established. So it positions as well just internal within our state.
All right. Any other responses?
Jan, I can chime in on this. In
Yeah.
California, I mean, our plan is integrated. I mean, we bring in maintenance along with capital work, because what we found is that as we're doing projections of where we expect to be, it's really critical to have the maintenance accomplishments in there. And so I would say, initially, I don't know if bringing the maintenance in was super popular within maintenance, but I think over time they've grown to appreciate the fact that it provides a forum in our plan to get to the legislative members in California to highlight where we are with maintenance and what's happening and what's not. So now I think they've kind of come full circle to the point where there's actually benefit to them, not in terms of federal funds, but in terms of state funding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm guessing the question was asking about federal funding, and I'm hearing from you guys that the answer is, not federal funds, but it may help you get state funds by putting it in your TAMP. All right, Monica Zong asked a question to Washington State DOT, and William provided an answer in the chat, but let's ask it and see if there is more to add from Washington State. Do you collect extreme weather data such as what the extreme weather is, the duration, and the severity? If so, how? Do you use a specific tool? What resilience measures do you have?
So we have, like William alluded to, we have an emergency management division in WashDOT. We also have a state emergency management office that collects a lot of this information that they use to manage it. Most of this is done outside of the TAMP. It's not that for part 667, like William alluded to, we strictly look at the ER type data and the ER database, and anything that we get that's eligible for ER funding to comply with part 667. But our emergency management division in WashDOT, as well as the emergency management office for the state, collects that for their purposes beyond what that is. So the two are separate. We don't have that data connected.
Yeah.
The only thing I would add is for at least for the 667 part, we do use a GIS app that we do work with to be able to track some of that information. But this is more, it's like, as Todd alluded to, it's more on the ER side for the NHS related portion, but that's the only thing I would add to that.
All right, thanks. Jocelyn Jones from Federal Highway asks, she's curious to hear how California Mpos have responded to the investment management tool that Mike shared.
Yeah, thanks for the question. They've responded very well, actually. We developed the tool, and then we've gone through and done a couple workshops and training sessions on it. We've had requests from cities and counties for us to open up the tool. Right now or as we initially developed it, it was kind of locked down for the NHS, and we pre-populated the conditions for them. But we had requests to open that up because they wanted to be able to manage all of their assets in there. So some of the feedback we got was that, it was very well received because it gave it gave them an analysis tool that they could have a conversation with their boards or their managers or whoever they were trying to explain that if they wanted certain condition outcomes, that they needed a certain level of funding. In some cases, they could use that as justification. But I'll say the biggest evidence that it was well received is that every MPO in California changed their targets in the 2022 TAMP. And because they said before, when they did it in the initial TAMP, they were trying to do their best, but they didn't really have any way to evaluate it. And so with the tool, they had a way to evaluate it, and took advantage of that across the board for all of our MPOs.
And Mike, another question from Zachary Thurber. He didn't understand clearly what you meant by the LCP repeated risks for the 667 requirement. Could you describe a bit more about the types of life cycle planning?
Yeah, so we track where we do emergency work of all kinds, whether it's federal ER or not. And the vast majority of it is not federal ER. But if you look at the spirit of why 667 is there in the context of asset management, it's to allow you or to help you recognize where you keep having to do urgent work to repair some sort of damage or emergency, in lieu of taking maybe a more longer range approach to it. And so from a life cycle planning standpoint, if you're getting federal ER, you would say, oh, well, I'm going to get 100% reimbursement. But what California puts forward in federal ER on an annual basis is multiple times what is available nationally for federal ER. And so for us, it becomes a life cycle question, because we would want to recognize these locations and possibly get a more comprehensive fix that's not going to have a subsequent emergency. That may be in our best interest in California, because a lot of the money that we're spending responding is not federal dollars. So we've broadened the concept to, which is, instead of paying for emergencies over and over again, look at how you could fix the problem for good. We've broadened that out to the greatest, to a much larger extent, to cover non-federal ER areas. So in that sense, it becomes a life cycle question, versus doing a whole bunch of fixes over a period of time. Can we get in and do one substantial change? And I'll give you a really good example. We're looking at realigning a route that we've done 6 or 8 different emergencies on over the last 15 years, because it keeps falling, portions of it keep falling into the ocean. And there are different places along the route, but it's the same problem. And until we relocate the route away from the coastline, we're going to continue to have these. And so we can recognize that, even though they're not all federal ER, but we can recognize that and do a project to realign the route away from the coastline.
Thanks, Mike. All right, let's see. And Matt Hobrick asks, I'd be curious to hear what the panel thinks about the Resilience Improvement Plan option introduced by IIJA, also known as BIL. Any discussion on the pros and cons of creating a RIP? And this one, let's start with the panel, but if others on the webinar want to share their views on this, please just unclick your mic and chime in. Who wants to go first?
I can, Todd, you want to do it?
Sure, I'll go first. So we don't have a RIP per se for that. What we have researched, and number one, let's back up. through Protect, right, you get let's talk about the benefits to doing this. You get up to 10% off your non-federal share of that, right? That helps. So that's some incentive for doing it. The guidance does have specific criteria, and we do participate in resilience planning, and we're still trying to explore the options to see will this qualify. So we explore and we participate with our state emergency management office in resilience planning for specifically the last one was for flooding. We have one for seismic activities. So we're still kind of unsure, doing an analysis to see if that qualifies for the RIP. We've not embarked to do one itself, just to do it because the act tells us to do it and has the outline. That's yet to be determined for Washington.
Colorado is in the process of developing our resilience improvement plan. It is a voluntary plan. There's a lot of, and this is just a warning, there's a lot of coulds in there. So, being a voluntary plan, there's a lot of voluntary information that you can put in the voluntary plan. Colorado chose to do it because we fully want to take advantage of the reduced match requirements that we will be expecting to compete on the competitive grant process. So for us is we're cheap and we're able to do the resilience improvement plan at a relatively small cost. And so, I think that the general thought there is, we'll be able to recoup our expenses for the first grant proposal we'll win. So why not? It's sort of a gain, as well as it better reinforces throughout the organization that resilience planning is a thing, and that again we do have a game plan for it.
Mike, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, we had previously done our vulnerability assessments and adaptation plans and have included mitigation of various risks in our investment plans. And our feeling is between those three things, we really have a resiliency improvement plan. So, whether we sell what we've already done or have to repackage it, I think we're still looking at that.
Yeah. Matt, how about you? You asked the question, curious what you're going to be doing.
Yeah, hi. I am not sure what we're going to be doing. I think we're still in conversations about it. That we definitely find it appealing that there is the option for the enhanced federal match. There was some guidance that came out about the RIPs here very recently, and one thing that's not terribly clear is kind of like how the RIPs are going to be evaluated. So I'm going to be a little curious sort of how that plays out, and what the potential downside of it might be. So I don't know if there's anyone who's got more knowledge of that who can comment on it.
What do you mean by downside? You mean like that the cost of it?
Well, yeah, just maintaining it, and there's I think a little bit of the way our analysis of it, to my understanding, is that there is some confusion about whether we need to include a list of projects in it or if it's more of a kind of a policy document. I think the guidance that we received sort of is ambiguous on that point. So
you do not need to put a list of projects in there. That is one of the voluntary items you can choose to put in. But talking to downside potential there is any agency should always be cautious in actually producing and publishing a list, because oftentimes your stakeholders will take that as a promise for investment.
Mhm. All right. Well, I think that we're actually at the end of our time. Just before we get to the final slide, curious of the panelists if you had any reactions to the poll, if there was anything that was a surprise to you, or did it look pretty much as you would expect it? In terms of, the numbers, I think it ended up around 15, 16 asking for the extension and the various, and only I think around 7 who hadn't. And then just the reasons being needing more time, or those who haven't, that they have done enough they had already built enough resiliency into their TAMPs. And then the issue of aligning the performance requirements that are due in October with the TAMPs better in terms of timing.
Yeah, this is Todd. I'll go out and just say I through the conversations we had at AASHTO, am a little bit surprised that the state DOTs whose TAMPs were due after July 1st didn't submit, just as a matter of caution, process, and then maybe still meet their initial timeline. I thought anecdotally we would have seen a lot of state DOTs just have that as maybe insurance, if you will. But at the end, it's an individual choice, right? You have to determine where you're at and what you want to do. I'm just shocked that more states didn't do that.
It's funny, Todd, I have almost the opposite reaction that says, if you've been doing the resilience, why don't you just be done?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say I was kind of in the same camp as Todd. I would have thought the vast majority of states would have applied for the extension. So the number that said no was more than I would have expected.
Yeah. William, any thoughts?
None that are unique.
Okay. Jonathan, how about you?
I think Mike and Todd had said previously what I was going to say. I think just seeing kind of the fact that they're, given the July deadline, just kind of who was going to take the flexibility, who wasn't. So I think I'm similar responses to what Mike and Todd had alluded to beforehand.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. Let's go to the last slide. Yes.
Can I offer?
Yes, definitely.
Towards the last topic. So Federal Highway, of course, we wanted to provide our partners the flexibility, because we understood that it was just going to be difficult to become compliant because of the cycle of being recertified. We also have a list of those states that did and did not decide to take on the flexibility. And one thing I would like to say, and that is something that Todd had mentioned earlier, and that is relationship. After we started having additional conversations with our division offices, what we found is that relationship is really the reason why some of those states chose not to, because they had already been working with the division all along. The division, and I think it was Washington, who said that they actually had different portions of their document that they had already been providing to the division office. So when they requested to be recertified, they already were familiar with the TAMP. So even though we have a number that I would say a lot of people may be surprised that states did not take on the flexibility, I think we should also err on the fact that that's because of the relationship. Our division offices, they believe in the product that they receive. They believe in their relationship. They would have already started talking to those state DOTs to encourage them to take that flexibility if they felt they were going to be running against a penalty. And so even though we don't have all of the states that took on that flexibility, I want to commend the states and our division offices for having that relationship and having those conversations, having those meetings, and understanding what you are receiving so that you would make sure that your state did not run into a penalty. So again, we do have states that may have been, that did not err on the side of caution, but I believe that they are secure in what they submitted.
Thank you, Tasha. That's a very important message. All right, so thank you to all of our panelists today on an excellent webinar and dialogue. And thank you all for sharing your thoughts and questions. So our next webinar is on October 19th, and the topic is on incorporating maintenance cost into a TAM. And this is going to be focusing on the results of the recently completed NCHRP project 2308. And then in December, on December 21st, our topic is going to continue the TAM and risk journey, and it's on TAM and resiliency building, which is going to be based on the results of the Federal Highway AASHTO sponsored peer exchange that will be held at the beginning of December. So thank you, everyone. You can go and register for these webinars, and they'll be continuing in 2023 and beyond. And so tam-portal.com. Thank you, everyone. Bye.